The audit room over the estate office at Rodon was whitewashed twice a year and smelled of lime and wet wool, and on the day after Lady Day, which fell that year upon a Sunday, being Monday the 26th of March, in the year 1821, there were 61 tenants of the Rodon estate sitting along its 2 long benches with their hats on their knees and their money in their pockets, waiting to be called. It was a bright, hard morning, with a wind out of the northeast. The blackthorn was out white along the Rodon lane, and there was still ice in the ruts at 8 o'clock. The 2 tall windows at the south end of the room threw the whole floor into stripes of clean spring sunlight, and the dust of 61 pairs of boots turned slowly in them, and every man in the room could see every other man's face perfectly well, which mattered a great deal to what happened before noon. Damaris Escott had walked the 9 miles from Barrowcombe with a basket on her arm, and had come in at 8:30 and taken the end of the second bench, nearest the door where the draught was. She was 29 that month. She was a tall woman, 5'6" in her shoes, with red-brown hair pinned up plainly under a linen cap and a black chip hat over it, and dark brown eyes set rather deep, and a broad, plain, weather-marked face that people generally called sensible and never called handsome until they had known her about 4 years, after which they could not think why they had ever said otherwise. She had on a russet stuff gown that had been turned once and let down twice, a white kerchief crossed at the breast, and pinned with a plain brass pin, a coarse Holland apron, and thick shoes that had been mended at the Taunton Fair in October. Her hands were cracked across the knuckles from the dairy, and stained brown in the creases from 3 weeks of cutting teasels, and she kept them folded in her lap. In the basket at her feet under a cloth were 2 fat capons, plucked and drawn the evening before, and £1 6s and 8d in silver tied up in the corner of a handkerchief. That was her rent. It had been her father's rent, and his father had not paid rent at all in that country, but had held under the same kind of paper, and the sum had not altered since the 10th of April, 1796, when the lease was signed. £1 6s and 8d, and 2 fat capons at Lady Day, and the best beast on the farm if the tenant died. For that, and for a fine of £420 paid down at the signing, out of the sale of her grandmother's land at Cothelstone, the Escotts held Barrowcombe Farm, the house, the linhay, the great orchard of 190 trees, the withy bed in the bottom, the 2 water meadows, the teasel ground on the south slope, and the right of common for 40 sheep on Broomfield Hill. 142 acres and a rod. It was not a gift, and it had never been one. It was a purchase. In the west of England, a man did not rent a farm by the year as they did up in the shires. He bought a lease that ran for the lives of 3 named persons, and he paid a great sum at the front of it. And after that he paid almost nothing at all, and when the last of the 3 named persons died, the whole thing fell in to the landlord like a ripe apple, house and orchard and all, and the tenant's family walked out of the door with what they could carry. Damaris knew that as she knew the number of trees in her orchard. She had known it since she was 16 years old. Mr. Ozias Kite sat at the trestle at the north end of the room with his back to the fire, which had been lit for him and for nobody else, and he did not look up when she came in. He was a lean, narrow man of about 40, with sandy grey hair cropped close to his head, and small steel spectacles that he pushed up on his forehead when he wanted to look at a face, and pulled down when he wanted to look at a page. and he wore a plain snuff-brown coat, and a black stock, and no jewellery of any kind, and there was ink along the side of his right hand, where it had dragged across a wet line. He had a green cotton umbrella leaning against the leg of the trestle. He was the agent and surveyor for Mr. Zachary Truscott of Bristol, who had bought the whole Rodon estate the summer before last, and had never once come down to see it, and he had been on the property for 7 months, and in that time he had thrown 4 holdings into 2, drained the Rodon moor, put up 800 yards of new hedge, raised the rents of every tenancy that was held from year to year, and made himself extremely disliked in a quiet and thorough manner by men who could not point to a single thing he had done that was wrong. Beside him sat his clerk, Mr. Pring, who was 22 and had a cold, and between them lay the new rent ledger of the estate, bound in dark green sheep with a red label, and a japanned tin box for the cash, and a bell. They began at 9. Mr. Pring read the names off the roll in the order of the parishes, and each man came up in his turn and set his money on the green baize, and had it counted, and swept into the box. And Mr. Kite wrote the entry, and blotted it, and said thank you. And the man went out, or stood back against the wall to hear the rest. There is nothing in the world slower than an audit, and nothing that country people like better. It went on all morning. Barrowcombe was the last parish on the roll because it was the furthest out, and Barrowcombe Farm was the last holding in Barrowcombe because it stood highest, and so Damaris Escott sat on the end of the second bench with her hands folded for 3 hours and a quarter, and listened to 60 other people pay. She was not uneasy. She had been paying, on that day, for 11 years, since she was 18. Old Mr. Woolcott, who had been steward at Rodon for 31 years, used to have her up first out of turn, because of the distance, and would give her a glass of milk, and ask after the orchard, and take the capons himself, and weigh them in his hand, and say that hers were always the heaviest in the parish, and that he was minded to complain of it. Mr. Woolcott had died in the January before last, 5 weeks after Sir Hugh Marchant, and the estate had been sold, and there was no milk now. At 12:15, Mr. Pring said, in his blocked voice, Barrowcombe Farm. Damaris got up and took her basket, and went down the middle of the room between the benches, and set the 2 capons on the end of the trestle, where the cloth was laid for them, and untied the corner of her handkerchief, and counted out £1 6 and 8 on the green baize, a sovereign, a crown, a shilling, a 6 and 8 in copper, and stood with her hands at her sides. Mr. Kite did not touch the money. He pulled his spectacles down and turned the ledger round on the trestle so that the page faced the room rather than himself, which was a thing he had not done once all morning, and he laid his flat hand on the page as though it might get up, and he said, not to her but out across the benches, in a clear, dry, carrying voice that reached the back wall without any effort at all, Barrowcombe Farm is not held by lease. There was the particular silence that comes into a room of 60 men when one of them has been struck at. I have gone through the whole of the late Sir Hugh's papers, Mr. Kite said, and there is a lease of Barrowcombe of the year 1796, granted to Nathaniel Escott, and it was granted for the lives of 3 persons, and I have those 3 persons in this ledger, and I have taken the trouble to look for the 3 of them in the parish register of Barrowcombe, and I found all 3, They are in the churchyard. Every life in that lease lies under the yew hedge on the north side of Barrowcombe Church, and the last of them has lain there since 1815. The lease determined in 1815. It has been dead for 6 years. He let that sit for a moment, and then he said, still to the room, since 1815 this woman has been in possession of a farm of 142 acres, and has paid £1 6 shillings and 8 pence a year for it, and has not held it by any right whatever. She has been suffered there. Mr. Woolcott suffered her there because he was old, and because he knew her father, and I do not say a word against Mr. Woolcott. But a steward's kindness is not a title. She is a person in the nature of a caretaker. She has been minding Barrowcombe. Somebody at the back of the room laughed. It was not a large laugh, and it was over almost as soon as it began, and afterwards nobody would own to it, but it went the whole length of the room, and Damaris heard it perfectly, and Mr. Kite heard it too, and it encouraged him, as such a sound will encourage a certain kind of man. He took the spectacles off altogether then, and looked at her for the first time that morning. You will understand, Miss Escott, he said, that I bear you no ill will at all, but land does not know who is fond of it. Barrowcombe will be laid to Mr. Whitmore's holding at Lady Day next, which will make a compact farm of 310 acres with a frontage on the turnpike, and Mr. Truscott will have a rent for it instead of a capon. You have a 12-month. The estate is not harsh. There is the cottage at the lane end, which is dry and has a garden of 1/4 of an acre, and you may have that at £3 a year, and I will speak for you if you ask for it civilly. And then, because she still had not said anything, and because a certain kind of man cannot bear to be looked at steadily by somebody he has just knocked down, he half turned back to the benches and lifted his voice, and said the sentence that people in that valley were still repeating 40 years afterwards. A woman does not hold land in the Dean, he said. She minds it until a man wants it. Nobody laughed at that one. Damaris Escott stood where she was, with her hands at her sides, and the money on the baize in front of her, and she did not weep, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not say one word in her own defense, then or for the rest of that day. Her color had come up hard across her cheekbones, and her jaw was set so tight that the muscle stood out under her ear, and anybody who knew her at all would have known exactly what that meant. And there were 11 men in that room who knew her that well, and every one of them looked at the floor. But she said nothing. She had been taught by a mother who died when she was 12 and by a sister who died when she was 19, that an answer given in a hot room is a gift to the man who made the room hot, and she had never once in her life found that lesson to be wrong. What she did instead was this. She waited until Mr. Kite had finished, and then she said, quietly enough that the men at the back had to lean in, "Will you take the rent, sir?" Miss Kite blinked. He had expected tears, or he had expected argument, and he had prepared for both, and he had prepared for nothing else. "I will take it," he said, "as a payment for use and occupation, and it will be entered so." "Then I should like a receipt," said Damaris, "in that name, or in any other, and I should like it dated." Mr. Pring wrote the receipt, and Mr. Kite signed it, and Damaris folded it once, and did not put it away. She stood with it in her hand, and she said, in the same level voice, as though she were asking the price of hurdles. "Under whose life do you say I have been holding, sir?" "Mister." Kite looked at her a moment. Then he turned the ledger back round and pulled his spectacles down and read out, "In the tone of a man doing a kindness he will not be thanked for. Bathsheba Escott, Nathaniel Escott, Grace Escott, buried, the register says, in 1804, in 1815, and in 1811. "Thank you," said Damaris, and she took the pencil that was lying on the trestle by the ledger, without asking for it, and turned the receipt over and wrote on the back of it, in a small square hand, the 3 names and the 3 years exactly as he had said them, and gave the pencil back, and said good day to Mr. Pring, who was the only person in the room who had gone red, and picked up her empty basket, and walked out down the middle of the floor between the 2 benches, with 61 men looking at her, and did not hurry, and did not look at any of them. Silas Chorley was standing against the wall by the door, with his hat in his hands. He was a cooper and cider merchant out of Taunton, 34, a big, slow-moving man with sandy hair going back off his forehead and forearms like a cart shaft, who came out to the Rodon audit every Lady Day, because half the estate's orchards sold him fruit, and it was the one day in the year he could see all of them at once. He had known Damaris Escott since she was a girl of 15, selling apples off the tail of a cart at Bishop's Lydeard, and he had bought her apples every autumn for 11 years, and had never once beaten her down on the price, and had mended the great screw of her cider press one November with his own hands, and would not take money for it. He had not spoken while Mr. Kite was speaking. He had thought of it. He had got as far as shifting his weight off the wall, and had felt the whole room lean with him, and had understood, in the way that slow men understand things very fast when it matters, that if he opened his mouth then, the story that went round the Dean by Sunday would be that Damaris Escott had a man to speak for her, and that this would cost her more in that valley than the farm was worth. So he said nothing either. As she came past him, he opened the door for her, which he would have done for anyone, and he said, "Your capons were the best there." "They generally are," said Damaris, and went out. She walked the 9 miles home. It took her 3 hours and 10 minutes, because the wind was against her over Broomfield Hill, and it was the only 3 hours in the whole business in which she was not entirely sure of herself, and she said afterwards, when she was an old woman and could say such things, that she had gone over the same 4 sentences the whole way up the hill, like a horse going round a gin, and that they were, "He has read the register, he has read the ledger, he has not read the lease, and God be thanked, I have." The house at Barrowcombe stood high on the south slope, with its back into the hill, a long low house of pink-grey local stone, under a thatch that wanted doing on the west end, with a stone porch, a great chimney, and a cobbled yard in front of it, with a mounting block and a pump. There was a linhay for the cattle, and a cider house, with a stone trough and a screw press, and a barn with a threshing floor of elm boards, and beyond the yard the orchard went away down the slope in rows. 190 trees of Kingston Black and Slackmagirdle, and Hangdown, and Tom Putt, all of them older than she was, and 30 of them older than the house in the bottom. Along the stream lay the Withy bed. On the south slope, in the warm ground, lay 4 acres of teasels. It was 3:45 when she came into the yard. A boy of 12 was standing on the mounting block with his back to her, holding a bucket in each hand for the weight of it, which was a thing she had told him not to do. And he got down off it when he heard the gate and set the buckets on the cobbles and said, "You are late, Mr. Morris." There was no milk in it, he said. He said the word milk carefully, the way he said all his words, because his chest whistled in a wet march, and he had learned young to spend his breath sparingly. His name was John Combe. He was 12 years and 5 months old. He was small for his age, and would be small for it until he was 17, and then he would go up like a beanpole in one summer and end at 6 feet, but nobody knew that yet. He had straight black hair that would not lie down at the crown and grey eyes and a chin like the end of a spade, and he was quick past all reason with figures, and he had lived at Barrow Combe since he was 2 years old, and he was the 4th life in the lease of Barrow Combe Farm, and he had been the 4th life in the lease of Barrow Combe Farm since the 12th of September, 1810, and it had cost Damaris Escott £240 of her own earning to put him there. He did not know that. Nobody in the parish under 60 knew it, and most of those who had known it had forgot, because it was 11 years ago, and because it had been done quietly on a Wednesday in an estate office with the door shut, and because the 2 men who had witnessed it were a steward who was now dead and a vicar who never in 68 years repeated anything he was not obliged to repeat. Damaris took her hat off and hung it on the peg inside the door and washed her hands and face at the pump. And then she went into the kitchen and stood on a chair and took down from the top shelf of the dresser, from between a stone jar of goose grease and a canister that had had tea in it once, a japanned tin box the size of a large book, black with a thin gold line round the lid. It had never been buried, and it had never been sewn into anything. It stood on the dresser shelf in the open, where any fool could have seen it, and where several fools had, and that was deliberate too, because Mr. Woolcott had told her once that the papers people lose are the papers they hide, and that the safest place for a deed is the shelf where the tea is kept, since a thief wants silver, and a fire takes everything alike, and there is nothing to be done about a fire but keep the thatch cut back from the chimney. Inside the box, wrapped in a square of unbleached linen, were 4 things: her mother's marriage lines, her father's spectacles, which nobody could wear, a receipt on a half-sheet of foolscap dated the 12th of September, 1810, in the hand of Ambrose Woolcott, steward, acknowledging the sum of £240 received of Damaris Escott, spinster, of Barrow Combe, being the fine agreed for the adding of 1 life to the lease of the said farm. And, folded 3 times and rather stiff, 1 skin of parchment about 2 feet by 18 inches, written on both sides in a clerk's engrossing hand with the first 3 words a foot long, with a tag of parchment at the foot of it, and a disc of red wax the size of a crown piece pressed on the tag, and in the top left corner, impressed into the skin itself and darkened with time, the government stamp. That was the lease. This indenture, made the 10th day of April in the year of our Lord, 1796, between Sir Hugh Marchant of Rodan in the county of Somerset, baronet of the one part, and Nathaniel Escott of Barrow Combe in the said county, yeoman, of the other part. And then the recital, and then the parcels, which ran on for half a side, and named every field on the farm by the name it had been called by in her great-grandfather's time, and was still called by Long Ridding and Priest's Close and the 119 acres, and Cuckoo Hill, and the Sheep Slate and Well Furlong and the Bottom, and the Withy Bed thereto belonging. And then the Habendum, to have and to hold the said Messuage lands and premises unto the said Nathaniel Escott, his executors, administrators, and assigns for the term of 99 years, if the said Bathsheba Escott, Nathaniel Escott the younger, and Grace Escott, or any of them, should so long live. If any of them should so long live. That was the whole of it. Not for 99 years, for 99 years, or the last breath of the last of three named people, whichever came first, and everybody in the west of England understood the arithmetic of that sentence, the way a sailor understands a tide table, and the arithmetic had been running against the Escotts for 17 years. And then, on the back of the skin, in a different ink and a different hand, and much smaller, was the endorsement. Memorandum, it said, the 12th day of September, 1810, whereas 2 of the lives within named are since deceased, and whereas the sum of £240 hath this day been paid to the said Sir Hugh Marchant by Damaris Escott, spinster, daughter of the within named Nathaniel Escott. It is hereby agreed and declared that the within written lease shall be held and enjoyed for and during the natural life of John Combe of the parish of Barrowcombe in the said county, an infant of the age of 2 years or thereabouts, son of Sarah Combe, widow, deceased, in the same manner and to all intents as if the said John Combe had been named a life in the said lease at the making thereof, and under that, the same red wax, and the old man's own signature, Hugh Marchant, gone shaky at the H, and under that again, in 2 different hands, witness, Ambrose Woolcott. Steward, witness, Thomas Loveridge. Clerk, vicar of this parish. Damaris sat down at the kitchen table with the parchment open in front of her, and the tin box beside it, and the receipt in her hand, and read the whole of it through twice, which took her 20 minutes. And then she got up and cut bread and cheese for the boy, and for herself, and put the kettle on the crane, because it was gone 4, and neither of them had eaten since 7. John Combe watched her over the top of his bread. He was a boy who did not ask questions, which was the only thing about him she had never been able to mend. Was it bad at the audit? He said at last. It was, said Damaris. Are we to go? He said. No, she said. And then, because she had made a rule for herself when he was 5 years old that she would never tell him a comfortable thing that was not also a true thing, she said, a man there has made a mistake in his book, and he has made it out loud in front of 60 men, and it is going to cost him a great deal of trouble to get out of it, and none of the trouble is going to be ours. But it will take some months, and it will cost money, and I shall be from home a good deal. You will have to see to the calves. I always see to the calves, said John Combe. Then you will have to see to them without being told, said Damaris, and that will be new. She wrote 3 letters that evening at the kitchen table, with the boy doing sums beside her, on a slate for the pleasure of it. The first was to Mr. Aaron Sully, attorney at law, of Hammett Street, Taunton, asking for an hour of his time on the Saturday and stating in 4 lines what had been said to her and by whom and before how many people. The second was to the Reverend Thomas Loveridge, at the vicarage, half a mile down the lane, though she could have walked it in 10 minutes. and she wrote it rather than walked it because she wanted it on paper and dated. It asked him whether he would be so good as to look in the register for the baptism of John Combe, and for the burials of Nathaniel Escott the elder and Nathaniel Escott the younger, and to say whether he recollected witnessing a memorandum on a lease at Rodon in September 1810. The third was to Mr. Kite, and it was 2 sentences long, and it said that she had received his statement that she held no lease, that she did not agree with it, and that her attorney would write to him in the coming week. She did not write anything about the sentence he had said to the room. She never wrote anything about it, and she never repeated it, and in 52 years she said it aloud exactly once, in 1863, to a girl of 17 who had been told something similar at a hiring fair. And the girl remembered every word of it and wrote it down that night, which is the only reason it is known that Damaris Escott ever thought about it at all. Mr. Aaron Sully was 71 and had been the Escott family's attorney for 40 years, chiefly because nobody else in Taunton would put up with him. He had gout in both feet, and a bad temper, and a straight spine, and a strong dislike of being agreed with. His office in Hammett Street was up 11 stairs, and had 1 window and 4,000 documents in it, and he received Damaris on the Saturday morning in a wig that had not been dressed since the peace, and he made her sit down and go through the whole of the audit from the beginning, without once interrupting her, which for Mr. Sully was an act of some violence. Then he said, "Give it here." He read the lease with a glass. He read it as an old horse dealer looks at a horse, from the feet up, and he read the parcels and the habendum, and turned it over, and read the memorandum 3 times, and then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for 2 full minutes with his fingers laced across his waistcoat. "You paid £240, he said. "I did, at 18 years old. "I did." "Out of what?" "Out of teasels," said Damaris, "and butter and cheese, and the withy bed let for 3 years forward, and 2 heifers, and 91 geese, and 111 pounds of honey, and 4 pounds 10 that my sister gave me out of her own box, and the whole of it took me 2 years and 7 months. Mr. Sully looked at her over the glass. "Does that gentleman know it?" he said. "He does not." "Does anybody know it?" "Mr. Woolcott knew it, and he is dead." "Mr. Loveridge knows it." "Mr. Truscott's own papers must know it, if his lease book went with the estate, and I should think it did." "And the boy," said Mr. Sully. "Does the boy know it?" "He knows he is a parish child that I took," said Damaris. "He does not know he is the life. I never told him, because I could not see how to tell him without putting a weight on a child that no child should carry, and now I shall have to tell him, and I have been thinking about how to do it since Thursday afternoon, and I have not found the way yet." Mr. Sully grunted. Then he laid the parchment flat on the desk and put his hand on it, which was the same gesture Mr. Kite had made on the ledger, and it is a curious thing that 2 men so unlike should have had the same trick of holding down a page they meant to rely on. "Now attend," he said. "I will tell you what you have, and then I will tell you what he has, and then I will tell you why this will take 6 months and not 6 days, and you will not like the last part. What you have is a lease for 3 lives, with a 4th life properly added by memorandum on payment of a fine, executed by the lesser himself, sealed, witnessed by his own steward and by the incumbent of the parish, and stamped. The stamp is the sweetest thing on the whole skin. An instrument of this kind is nothing without the impressed stamp, and the stamp cannot be got afterwards without a penalty and a certificate, and yours is impressed in the skin, and the die is dated. It is a piece of the Crown's own evidence sitting in the corner of your paper. Any man may forge a signature. Nobody forges a stamp office die for the sake of 140 acres in the Dean. What he has is a rent ledger made up in 1819 by a clerk out of an older ledger, and a parish register. He has read them both carefully, and he has read nothing else, and he has made 2 errors, and the second one is a great deal worse than the first. The first is that he does not know of the memorandum. That is not, I am sorry to say, wholly his fault, since the memorandum is on the back of your skin and the estate's own note of it is in a book he has evidently never opened. The second is this. He told you the 3 lives died in 1804, 1815 and 1811. The life in your lease is Nathaniel Escott the Younger, your brother, who was drowned in the Tone in 1806, and who is entered in that register in that year, in that name, in those words. Your father, Nathaniel Escott the Elder, was never a life in anything. He was the lessee. A lessee is not a life. That gentleman has looked down a column, found the name he wanted, and taken the later of 2 burials, because it made a tidier story. And if he had taken the earlier one, as he was bound to, his own case would have obliged him to say that Mr. Woolcott suffered you on that farm for 10 years without a scrap of paper, which no steward who ever drew breath would do, and no auditor would have passed. His arithmetic contradicts his own accusation. When a man's proof proves too much, he has generally stopped reading too soon. Then he is finished, said Damaris. He is wrong, said Mr. Sully. That is not at all the same thing, and you are old enough to know it. He set out then, in the flat voice he used for bad news, exactly what a man in Mr. Kite's position would do, and he was right about every step of it, which Damaris found less comforting than he seemed to expect. Mr. Kite would not look at her parchment and say thank you and go home. He would say, quite properly, that a tenant's own copy of an instrument proves nothing by itself until it is set against the lesser's copy, because there are 2 parts to every lease, and the tenant keeps the part the landlord sealed, and the landlord keeps the counterpart the tenant sealed. And the whole point of the arrangement is that the 2 must agree. He would say that no fine of £240 appeared anywhere in the rent ledger of 1819, which was true, because a fine is not rent and is not entered in a rent ledger, but which would sound very well indeed said aloud to men who had never seen either book. He would say that the memorandum was written in a hand not the same as the body of the lease, which was also true and entirely usual. He would hint, without quite saying it, that an old steward within a year of his own death might have been persuaded to sign a great many things by a determined young woman who cooked his dinner on audit day. And then he would take out the only real weapon he had, which was time and money, and he would serve a notice to quit, and let her spend £100 she did not have on proving what she already knew. Then what do we do? Said Damaris. We find the other part, said Mr. Sully, the estate's own book. Every steward that ever lived kept a lease book, and Ambrose Woolcott kept 2 books, because he kept a rough one and a fair one, and the fair one will have the memorandum entered in it in his own hand on the day it was made, because he witnessed it, And a man does not witness a thing at 11 in the morning and forget to enter it at 4 in the afternoon. Find me Woolcott's lease book, and I will have that gentleman's ledger for a saddlecloth. Where is it? Mr. Sully spread his hands. Sold with the estate, he said. Muniments go with the land. Sir Hugh died. Mr. Julian Marchant sold everything he could take the roof off, and the deeds and the court rolls and the lease books will have gone up to whatever attorney conducted the purchase for Mr. Truscott, and will be lying in a strong room in Bristol under a label, which is a great deal better than being in a bonfire, and a great deal worse than being in this office. Will they show it me? They are not obliged to show you the time of day, said Mr. Sully. He charged her 5 guineas for that morning, and she counted it out on the desk, and he took it. And when she said that Mr. Woolcott had never charged her anything, he said that Mr. Woolcott had been a steward and not an attorney, and had been paid by the man on the other side, and that she had better get used to paying for advice, since advice she had paid for was the only kind anybody ever took. The notice came on the 4th of April. It was a printed form with the blanks filled in, and it required Damaris Escott, or all others whom it might concern, to quit and deliver up possession of the Messuage and lands known as Barrow Combe Farm on the 25th day of March next ensuing, and it was signed by Ozias Kite, agent for the owner. It was served by a man from Bridgewater who would not come into the yard because of the dog, and who read it out at the gate to nobody in particular, which is what the law required, and what made it a public thing. 9 people were at the gate by the time he had finished, because it was a Wednesday, and the Barrow Combe women were at the stream washing, and by Friday it was in Taunton Market, and by the Sunday after that it was in every parish from Bishop's Lydeard to Wellington, and the version that travelled was not the version Mr. Kite would have chosen. What travelled was the sentence. A woman does not hold land in the Dean, she minds it until a man wants it. It travelled because it was short, and because it had been said in front of 61 men, and because there is no parish in England where a sentence like that is heard by only the woman it was aimed at. Easter Monday that year fell on the 23rd of April, and the vestry of Barrow Combe met in the church at 10 in the morning, as it had met on Easter Monday for 400 years, to pass the overseer's accounts and appoint the churchwardens and the waywarden and settle the rate. It was not a court. It had no power whatever over a lease, but it was the one gathering in the parish that every man in it had a right to attend. And it kept books, and its books were public, and Damaris Escott had understood since she was 18 years old that in England a thing written down in a book that anybody may see is worth more than a thing shouted in a room. She was there when it opened, at the back, with her hands folded. 31 men were there, which was 11 more than usual. Mr. Kite was not there, and had not been asked, and had no business there. The accounts were passed. The rate was fixed at 9p in the pound. Mr. Whitmore was chosen churchwarden, and looked as though he wished he had stayed at home. Because Mr. Whitmore was the man who was to be given Barrow Combe at Lady Day next, and who had not asked for it, and did not want it, and had lain awake about it since the audit. And then the Reverend Thomas Loveridge, who was 68, and had buried 3 generations of Escotts, and had a voice like a bassoon and a horror of unpleasantness, stood up and said that before the meeting was closed he would beg the indulgence of the vestry for 2 entries out of the register, since he had been asked in writing for copies of them, and since he preferred that the parish should hear what he was going to put his name to. He read out the burial of Bathsheba Escott, wife of Nathaniel Escott of Barrow Combe, the 4th of November 1804. He read out the burial of Nathaniel Escott the younger, of Barrow Combe, aged 21, drowned in the River Tone, the 9th of February 1806. He read out the burial of Grace Escott, spinster, of the same, the 12th of March 1811. He read out the burial of Nathaniel Escott the elder, of the same, yeoman, the 2nd of August 1815. And then he turned back some pages and read out the baptism of John, son of Sarah Combe of this parish, widow, born the 11th day of October, and baptized the 6th day of November, in the year 1808. He shut the book. "Gentlemen," he said, "I say nothing at all about leases, which are not my business, and which I do not understand. I say only that there were 2 Nathaniel Escotts in this parish, and they are not the same man, and that anybody who takes the one for the other will go wrong by 9 years. And I say further, since I am asked, that on the 12th of September in the year 1810, I rode to Rowdon at Mr. Woolcott's asking, and put my name as a witness to a memorandum upon the Escotts' lease, and that Sir Hugh Machen set his own seal to it in my sight, and that the substance of it was the adding of a life, and that the life added was the child whose baptism I have just read to you. I remember the day because it was the day my mare cast a shoe at Cothelstone, and I walked her home. That is all I know, and I shall put my hand to every word of it. There was a silence in the church, and then a good deal of noise, and old Mr. Yandel, who was 80 and deaf, and had been listening with his hand behind his ear, said in the carrying voice of the deaf, "Then the maid holds till the boy dies, and the boy's 12, and there is not a man in this church will live to see it out." They wrote it in the vestry book. Not the lease, which was none of their business, but the fact of the reading, in the churchwarden's own minute, in Mr. Loveridge's hand, signed by 31 men, and dated. It cost nothing, and it bound nobody, and it was, as Mr. Sully said when he saw a copy of it, worth about £40 of anybody's money, because from that morning forward, not one man in the Vale of Taunton Dean believed Mr. Ozias Kite, and Mr. Ozias Kite had 11 months in which to find that out. Damaris walked home up the lane behind the church with her basket, and did not say anything to anybody, and when she got into the yard she sat down on the mounting block, which she had not done since she was a girl, and put her hands over her face for about the length of time it takes to say the Lord's Prayer, and then got up and went and looked at the calves. To understand why a woman of 29 could stand in a room full of men and be told she had no right to her own kitchen and not answer, it is necessary to go back 25 years to a morning in April in 1796, when her father put on his good coat and rode down to Rowdon to buy a farm with a piece of paper. Nathaniel Escott the elder was then 38, and had been at Barrow Combe all his life and his father before him, but not by lease. The Escotts had been tenants at will for 2 generations, which meant they held the farm from year to year at the pleasure of the merchants, and could be turned out at 6 months' warning. And Nathaniel Escott's own father had died in the belief that this arrangement was as good as a lease, because the merchants were good people. Nathaniel Escott did not believe that. He had watched a tenant at will at Cothelstone put out at a fortnight over a quarrel about a hedge, and he had gone home from that and sat by the fire until 2 a.m. and made up his mind, and it had taken him 9 years to do it. What he did was to sell his mother's land. She had brought 16 acres at Cothelstone into the marriage, poor stony ground on the wrong side of the hill, and it came to him at her death, and he sold every rod of it in the spring of 1796 to a man who wanted it for the stone, and he got £460 for it. And he took 420 of that down to Sir Hugh Marchant, and asked for a lease of Barrowcombe for 3 lives. Sir Hugh was then 68, and had the reputation of being close, which was unjust. He was not close. He was exact. And the difference is that a close man wants more than his due, and an exact man wants precisely his due, and cannot be moved a farthing off it. He looked at the money, and he looked at Nathaniel Escott, and he said that the fine was well enough, and the rent should stand at what it had always been, £1 6 shillings and 8 pence and 2 capons, and that Escott might name his 3 lives, and that he had better name them carefully, because he would not get another such bargain out of Rodon in his lifetime, and neither would his son. Nathaniel Escott had thought about that for 9 years too. He named his wife Bathsheba, who was 33 and had never had a day's illness. He named his son Nathaniel the younger, who was 11 and could already do a day's work. And he named his elder daughter Grace, who was 8. He did not name Damaris, who was 4 years old that month, and was at that moment sitting on the kitchen floor at Barrowcombe with a wooden spoon, and this was not unkindness and was not carelessness. It was arithmetic, of a kind everybody in the west of England did in their heads, and nobody wrote down. 3 lives was the custom, and 3 lives was what the fine was reckoned on. And a man naming 3 lives named the 3 he thought would run longest. And in 1796 a child of 4 was very much less likely to see 30 than a child of 8. Because of the summer diarrhea and the measles and the smallpox and the 100 other things that took children between the cradle and the schoolroom, and the mortality tables the lawyers used said so in plain figures. He named Grace because Grace was through it. It was a sensible decision, taken by a careful man on the best advice available to him, and it was the ruin of his family, and he lived long enough to know it, and Damaris never once in her life heard a word said against him for it, chiefly because she never allowed a word to be said. So the lease was engrossed on one skin of parchment by Sir Hugh's clerk, and stamped and sealed and delivered, and Nathaniel Escott rode home with it inside his coat and put it in a japanned tin box on the top shelf of the dresser between the goose grease and the tea canister, and for the next 8 years the Escotts of Barrowcombe were as safe as any family in Somerset that did not own its own land. They were not rich, and they were never idle. 142 acres on that slope, with the cold ground at the top, and the good red loam in the bottom, and 4 acres of teasels on the sunny bank, would carry 20 milking cows, 40 sheep on the hill, a horse and a colt, 60 geese, the orchard, and a family. What it would not carry was any accident at all. There was no margin in it, and everybody knew there was no margin, and that is why farming families of that kind counted everything and wasted nothing, and were regarded by the gentry as mean. and why they in turn regarded the gentry as people who had never in their lives had to make a decision that could not be undone. Bathsheba Escott was a Chiji from Huls, a small, dark, quick woman who had been taught to write by a Methodist and to keep accounts by her mother, and she kept the dairy book at Barrow Combe from the day she married into it. Damaris learned to read out of that book, not out of a horn book and not out of the Bible, though she had both, out of a stitched-up dairy book in her mother's hand, in which every pound of butter that left the house between 1789 and 1804 was entered with the date, the weight, the buyer, and the price, and every cheese, and every score of eggs, and the geese at the back end, and the cider by the hogshead, and at the foot of each year a total carried over in red ink. There were 15 of those books on the shelf by the time Damaris was 10, and she had read them the way other children read stories, and she could tell you at 8 years old that a wet June cost 4 shillings in the pound on the cheese, and she thought that everybody's mother could do this. Her mother taught her 3 things that she used for the rest of her life. The first was that a figure written down at the time is worth 10 remembered afterwards. The second was that you never argue with a man about money in front of other men. You go home and get the book. The third she gave her at the very end, in November of 1804, when she was dying of a quinsy in the room over the kitchen at the age of 41, and it took her 4 days, and on the 3rd day she made them send the boy and Grace out, and had Damaris up on the bed and said, "You are 12. You are the one of the 4 that counts, and Grace will never be strong, and Nat is your father over again, and will not look at a paper till it bites him. Get the tin box off the shelf when I am gone, and read what is in it, and understand it. Do not ask your father to explain it. He will tell you not to trouble your head. Read it yourself until you understand every word, and if there is a word you cannot get, walk down to Mr. Loveridge and ask him, and do not be ashamed, because there is no shame in not knowing, and a great deal of shame in not asking." Damaris Escott got the tin box off the shelf on the 15th of November, 1804, 6 days after her mother was buried, and carried it out to the linhay where nobody would see, and sat on a sack of oats and opened it, and could not read 1 line in 5 of it. She was 12 years old. She took it down to the vicarage the next week, and Mr. Loveridge, who was then 55 and had a curate and time on his hands and no children of his own, looked at the parchment and looked at the child and said, "I shall want 3 hours a week, and you will want 2 years. And we had better begin with what a life means." They began with what a life means. It took him a winter to make her see it, not because she was slow, but because she kept refusing the sense of it. She would say, "But it is our farm." He would say, "It is your farm, while Bathsheba Escott, Nathaniel Escott the younger, and Grace Escott, or any of them, shall so long live." She would say, "My mother is dead." He would say, "Yes, and Grace?" And she would count on her fingers and say, "Then it is ours while Nat lives or Grace lives." And he would say, "Just so, and not 1 hour longer." And she would sit and look at the parchment with her jaw set, exactly as she set it at the audit 17 years afterwards. He taught her Latin too, badly, because he was a bad Latinist, but well enough that she could get through the recitals in a deed and the entries in a court roll, and he taught her the hands, secretary hand and the engrossing hand and the abbreviations, and how to tell a copy from an original, and how to read a stamp. He did all this for a farmer's daughter, for nothing at all, 3 hours a week, for 4 years. Because he had been a poor scholar himself, and because, as he told his sister once, the child asked better questions in a fortnight than his curate had asked in 9 years. The River Tone came down in flood on the 6th of February, 1806, after a thaw on top of 9 days of rain, and it took out the footbridge below Ham Mills, and drowned 400 acres of the moor, and stood 11 feet up the wall of the mill house. Nathaniel Escott the younger was 21. He had gone down to Taunton on the Wednesday the 5th, with 2 hogsheads of cider on a wain, and had stayed the night, and on the Thursday morning, the 6th, he had tried the ford at Bathpool with the horses, because the road round by the bridge was a matter of 5 miles, and he had a girl at Rishton he meant to see. He got the horses out. He did not get himself out. They found him 3 days afterwards, 1.5 miles down, in a willow bed, and they brought him home on a hurdle up the lane past the church at 4 p.m. on the 9th of February, with half the parish walking behind, and Mr. Loveridge buried him the same evening, because of the state of the water and the weather. Damaris was 13. She stood in the churchyard in the dark with a lantern, and did the only arithmetic she was capable of doing that night, which was that the tin box on the dresser now had one name left in it, and that name was her sister Grace, who was 17, and had coughed all through the previous winter. Her father had a seizure of the palsy 19 days later, on the 28th of February, in the yard, between the pump and the linhay door, and he was carried in and laid on the settle, and lived 9 years and 5 months after it, and never again spoke a sentence that a stranger could follow. His right hand was gone entirely. He could say yes and no, and the names of his children, and the names of the fields, and he could make himself understood to Grace and to Damaris about most ordinary matters if they were patient, and he could not write his name, and he knew perfectly well what had happened to him, which was the worst part of it. He sat in the porch in fine weather, and in the chimney corner in bad, and he watched his farm being run by 2 young women, and when Damaris was 16 and had begun to take the milk down to Taunton herself, he would put out his left hand as she went by with the yoke, and hold her wrist for a moment, and that was the whole of what he had left to say, and she understood it well enough. Grace Escott took the house, and Damaris took the yard, and that division held for 5 years, and was never once discussed. Grace was 17 and gentle, and had been her mother's favorite and could not lift a full pail. She did the cooking and the dairy work that could be done sitting, and the mending, and the nursing of her father, and she kept the house so clean that women came from Halsey to look at it. Damaris was 13, and then 14, and then 15, and she did the cows and the calves and the hill and the orchard and the cider and the market, and she grew 4 inches in 18 months, and got the hands she had for the rest of her life. They were not left to sink, that should be said, because it is the fashion to tell these stories as though a whole parish stands about with its hands in its pockets, and no parish in Somerset ever did. Mr. Whitmore's father lent them a man for the hay for 3 years running, and would not be paid. The Andals took their sheep on the hill with their own, and charged them nothing for the shepherding. Widow Dyke came up 2 days a week for 4 years for her dinner and a shilling. Mr. Loveridge went on with the 3 hours of Latin and reading, and moved them to the evening because of the milking, and never once suggested that a girl who was now doing a man's work had better give up her books. And old Ambrose Wilcott, the steward at Rodon, who could have put the whole family off the place at any time after the father's seizure and would have been thought perfectly reasonable for doing it, did the opposite. He came up to Barrowcombe in the April of 1806, sat in the kitchen for 2 hours, drank 3 cups of tea, looked at the beasts and at the orchard, and at the state of the hedges, and rode home and wrote in his rough book against Barrowcombe the words the daughters do very well. Say nothing to Sir Hugh. What the parish did not do, because it did not occur to anybody, was tell Damaris Escott about the lease. Everybody assumed she knew, because everybody in the Dean knew how leases worked, and everybody assumed that a girl of 13 was not thinking about it. She was thinking about nothing else. She had been thinking about nothing else since her mother died. She had the whole shape of it in her head by the time she was 14 years old, and what she had was this: one life stood between her family and the road, and that life was Grace's, and Grace was 20 and coughing. She could not add a life without money, and she had no money, and she could not sell anything that belonged to the farm, because the farm was not hers to sell, and she could not borrow, because nobody lends to a girl of 14 with a lease running on one bad chest. And she could not tell anybody she was frightened, because the moment the parish began to say that Barrowcombe was going down, the cheese factor would drop his price, and the cider merchant would drop his, and the men who lent a horse for the hay would begin to lend it a week later than they had meant to, and the whole slow warm machinery of being thought all right would go into reverse and never come back. She had watched that happen to a family at Hulse, so she said nothing about it to anybody at all for 2 years, and worked and thought, and in the middle of February 1808, 3 weeks before her 16th birthday, Ambrose Wilcott sent word up that she was to come down to Rowdone on the Wednesday, and to come alone. She walked the 9 miles and got there at 11, and was put in the little room off the estate office with the map of the manor on the wall, and Mr. Wilcott came in with his gouty foot in a slipper, and sat down opposite her, and put his hands on his knees, and said, "Miss Escott, how old are you?" 16 next month, sir. And your sister?" 20, sir." Mr. Wilcott looked at the window for a while. "I saw your sister at the church at Christmas," he said. "I am going to say a hard thing to you, and I am going to say it once, because I am 70 and gouty, and I may not be here in 5 years, and because if I do not say it, there is nobody left in the world who will. Your lease stands upon your sister's life. When she goes, Barrowcombe goes back to Sir Hugh, and Sir Hugh will not give it to you, not because he is unkind, but because he is exact. And there will be 4 farmers at his elbow with £400 in their hands within a month, and he will take the best offer, and it will not be yours. And you and your father will go to your mother's people at Hulse, and the boy is dead, and there is an end of the Escotts at Barrowcombe after 130 years. Damaris Escott said, "I know it, sir." "You know it," said Mr. Wilcott. "I have known it since I was 12, she said. "What is the fine to add a life?" He sat back. He told her afterwards, years afterwards, that in 31 years of stewarding he had had that conversation 11 times, and had never once had the second question come back at him inside 4 seconds, and that it had taken the wind clean out of him, and he had had to look at the map to get his face straight. Sir Hugh, he said at last, would ask 300 and would take 240, and I can get him to 240 if I go about it the right way and if it is asked for before the life falls and not after. After it falls, there is no fine in the world will do you any good, because there is nothing left to add a life to. Do you understand that? The paper must be mended while it is whole. 240 pounds, said Damaris. And the stamp, said Mr. Woolcott, and the engrossing, and my clerk call it 246. How long will you give me? Mr. Woolcott picked up a pen and put it down again. I cannot give you anything, he said. It is not mine to give. Your sister will give you what she gives you, and nobody else has any say in it. If you ask me as a man who has seen a good many chests, I should say 3 winters, and I should not care to promise the 4th. Damaris Escott sat still for a moment in that little room with the manor map on the wall, and then she said, Will you write down for me on a piece of paper exactly what I must bring, and to whom, and what must be done, in order, so that I do not come 9 miles with the wrong thing? Mr. Woolcott wrote it down. He kept a copy of what he had written, which is how it is known, and the copy is endorsed in his hand in ink that has gone brown, Barrow comb. The younger Miss E, aged 16. God help her, she will do it. She began that same week, and she began by making a book. It was a stitched paper book of 40 leaves that had been meant for the cheese, and she wrote across the first page, in the square hand her mother had taught her, what is wanted, 246 pounds. And underneath, ruled in 3 columns with a straightage and a pencil, what a thing might fetch, what it did fetch, and the date. She kept that book for 2 years and 7 months, and she did not miss a week in the whole of it. And it survives, and anybody who wants to know how a girl of 16 with no capital and no credit and no legal existence, separate from her father, raised 246 pounds in the Vale of Taunton Deane, in the reign of King George III, may read it for themselves, because it is all set down. The first thing in it, and the largest, was Teazles. Nobody outside the west of England has ever quite believed in the teazle. It is a thistly-looking head on a prickly stalk that will grow properly in about 4 counties in England, and best of all in the warm red ground of the Deane, and the hooked bracts of the dried head are the only thing in the world, before or since, that will raise the nap on fine broadcloth without tearing it. And every woolen mill from Wellington to Stroud bought them by the pack of 20,000 heads. 4 acres of good teazle ground was worth more in a scarce year than 40 acres of wheat, and it was the cruelest crop in England to bring in, because the heads must be cut one at a time with a curved knife in August in the heat, by hand, by people whose hands are cut to pieces by the middle of the 2nd day, and then dried in the sun, and turned, and sorted into kings and middlings and scrubs, and got under cover before the first wet, and one bad fortnight in September ruins the lot. Her father had grown teazles on the south bank all his life, and had always sold them standing in July to a factor from Wellington, which was the safe way, and the way that lost you 1/3 of the value. Damaris did not sell them standing in 1808. She cut them herself with Widow Dyke and 2 Yandle girls, and a boy, 21 days on her feet in the heat, and dried them on the linhay roof and on hurdles in the yard, and sorted them herself by lantern in the barn until 11 at night, and took them to Wellington in 3 loads on a borrowed wain, and stood in the yard of the Squirrel while 4 buyers looked at them, and would not take the first offer, and got £62.10, which was more than the farm's whole rent for 46 years. She was 16 years and 7 months old. She had the money in a canvas bag under the seat of the wain, and she did not tell anybody in the parish what she had got for them. And when the factor from Wellington came up in the following July to buy the crops standing, as usual, she said, in the pleasantest way in the world, that she thought she would cut them again. And he said she was a fool, and she agreed with him, and cut them. 1809 was a wet year, and the heads came small, and she got £38. 1810 she did sell standing, in July, for £45, because by then she had reckoned the days, and she could not spare 3 weeks in August away from the money she was making in other ways. £145 10 in 3 years, out of 4 acres of thistles. The second thing was butter. Barrow Combe made about 1,100 cwt of butter a year, and had sold it for 30 years to a factor who came round with a cart and took the whole of it at a penny under the Taunton price, which everybody in that valley thought was reasonable, because it saved the journey. Damaris did the arithmetic on the back of the cheese book one night in April 1808, and found that the penny was costing them £10 a year, and that the Taunton market was 9 miles off, and that she was going to be walking 9 miles anyway a good deal in the next 2 years, and that a yoke and 2 pails is not a heavier thing at the 8th mile than at the 2nd if you are used to it. So she began going in on the Wednesday and the Saturday with the butter and the eggs, and she got 2d in the pound over what the factor paid, and sometimes 3d, and she got to know the price of everything in Taunton Market by heart, which turned out afterwards to be worth more than the butter. And in 2 years and a half the difference came to £22 14, and she walked, by her own reckoning in the back of the book, 1,908 miles to get it. The third thing was the withy bed, and it was the hardest, because it was the only one that felt like selling the future. There were 3 acres of withies in the bottom that had been cut on a 3-year rotation since before the lease, and a basket maker at Bridgewater named Perryman had bought the cut every year for as long as anybody could remember. She went down to Bridgewater on the carrier's cart in the October of 1808 and asked Mr. Perryman what he would give for the whole cut of 3 years, paid down at once, and Mr. Perryman, who was 70 and had 4 sons and was not a fool, asked her why, and she told him. She told him the plain truth, which she had told nobody else, that there was 1 life left in her lease, and it was her sister's, and her sister was ill, and that she was raising a fine to add a life, and that if she did not raise it, there would be no withies to sell him ever again, because there would be no Escots at Barrow Combe. Mr. Perryman looked at her for a while, and then he said, I will give you £30, which is £4 under the value, and you will not beat me up, because I am buying 3 years of weather I cannot see, and that is worth £4 of anybody's money. And she said, done. And they shook hands on it, and he asked her before she went whether she had told her father, and she said her father could not be told anything, and he said, no more he can. Then I shall say nothing to anybody, and I shall want the first cut in November. He said nothing to anybody. That is not a small thing. A word from Mr. Perryman in the Bridgewater market, in the winter of 1808, would have gone round the Dean in a week, and would have finished her. And he was 70 and fond of talking, and he never said one syllable of it until the whole business was over and done with 12 years afterwards, when he was 82, and told it to a room at his own son's wedding and cried, which everybody put down to the cider. After that it was a matter of scraping. 2 heifers at Bishop's Lydiard Fair in the September of 1809, 17 pounds, which meant less milk the following year, and she knew it and did it anyway. 91 geese over 2 seasons, plucked 4 times a year for the down, and sold at the back end, 11 pounds 7. 111 pounds of honey, and the wax off 9 skeps, 5 pounds 4. 4 pounds 10 shillings out of Grace's own box, which Grace put into her hand in the July of 1810, and would not take back, and which was every penny Grace had in the world, saved out of egg money, since she was 14. That made 236 pounds and 5 shillings by the 1st of September, 1810. She wanted 10 pounds more. There was nothing left on the farm to sell that did not belong to the farm, except the colt. The old mare had thrown a colt foal in the spring of 1808, 3 weeks after the conversation at Rodan, and Damaris had reared him and broken him herself, at 16, in the orchard, with a rope halter, and a great deal of patience, and 1 broken finger she never told anybody about. He was a bay, with a white sock and a mean streak that she had talked out of him, and he was the one thing on that place that was hers by any reckoning, because the mare had been her mother's, and the mare's increase went with the mare. He was rising 3 in the September of 1810, and he was worth 10 pounds to anybody, and rather more to somebody who could see what he would be at 5. She took him to Taunton on the 8th of September, and sold him in the horse fair for 9 pounds 10 shillings to a coal hauler from Milverton who wanted him for the shafts, which was not what she had raised him for, and not the life she would have chosen for him, and she watched the man lead him away, and then she went and stood behind the 3 cups for about 4 minutes, with her back against the wall, and then she went and bought a quire of paper and a pennyworth of tape because she was going to want them, and walked home. That made 245 pounds and 15 shillings. On the 11th of September she killed and dressed 2 capons that had been meant for the Lady Day rent and were 4 months early, and carried them into Taunton on the Tuesday, and sold them at the top of the market for 5 shillings and 6 pence. 246 pounds and 6 pence. She wrote it in the book with the date, and ruled it off twice, and the 6 pence over she put in the japanned tin box on the top shelf of the dresser, and it was still in that box when she died in 1874, and it is in it now. She walked to Rodan on the 12th of September, 1810, and left at 4:30 in the morning to be there when the office opened, and carried the money in a canvas bag inside a butter basket with a cloth over it, and 4 pats of butter on top, on the principle that a girl carrying butter is invisible, and a girl carrying 246 pounds is not. Mr. Woolcott had the little room off the office ready. He had the green baize down, and a pair of scales, and a bowl of water for testing, because a great deal of bad silver moved about the county in those years, and he counted the whole of it himself on the table in front of her, which took him 50 minutes, 11 guineas in gold, 4 7-shilling pieces, a great deal of crown and half-crown silver, 114 shillings, and the rest in sixpences and copper, done up in paper rolls of £1 each in her own writing. He found one bad shilling and set it aside, and she gave him another. Then he wrote the receipt on a half-sheet of foolscap and signed it, and gave it to her, and she read it through before she folded it, and he watched her read it and said nothing. Then he said, "Now whose life?" And Damaris Escott said, "I should like to see the tables first, sir." Mr. Woolcott went out and came back with a small, thick book bound in calf, which was Dr. Price's Observations on Reversionary Payments, in the 4th edition with the Northampton tables in the back of it, and which was the book every steward and every attorney in England used for exactly this purpose. And he put it on the table, and turned it round, and put his finger on the column. They went through it together for the better part of an hour. Damaris had never seen the book before. She understood the first page of it in 11 minutes, which Mr. Woolcott afterwards described as the most alarming thing that had ever happened to him in an estate office. The tables told you, out of a great many recorded burials, how many years a person of any given age might on the average be expected to live, and the shape of the thing was not what people expected, and it was the shape that mattered. An infant of 1 year old had an expectation, by the Northampton tables, of about 32 years and some months. A child of 5 had an expectation of about 40 years. A youth of 16 had about 35. A woman of 25 had about 30. The point, which Mr. Woolcott made her say back to him twice, was that a life is at its most fragile in the first 3 years and at its best value from about 4 to about 10, and that a leasemonger who wanted length bought a healthy child of 5 or 6 and did not buy a baby, because too many babies died, and that everybody in the west of England knew this, and it was why the lives named in leases were so often the second and third sons of respectable farmers aged 7 or 8, and why a landlord would sometimes refuse an infant altogether. "If you name yourself," said Mr. Woolcott, "you are 18, and the tables give you something over 34 years, and you may reasonably expect to hold Barrow Combe until you are past 50, and after that it is your children's trouble and not yours. That is what 9 women in 10 would do, and there is nothing wrong with it." Damaris said, "And if I name a child of 6? "Then you buy 40 years, said Mr. Woolcott, "if the child lives, and you have some choosing to do among your neighbours' children. And every family in this parish will fall out with every other family over it inside a fortnight, and half of them will come to you afterwards and want something for it, and one of them will come to you in 9 years' time and say that the farm is in some sort his, and he will be wrong. But it will make you a great deal of unpleasantness for a very long while. And if I name a child of 2, said Damaris. Miss. Woolcott put his hand flat on the table. If you name a child of 2, he said, you are gambling on the worst 3 years of a human life to buy the longest term the tables will give you. If he lives to 5, you have bought 50 years, and you will never pay another fine as long as you live. If he does not live to 5, you have thrown away £246 and every hour of the last 2 years and 7 months, and there is no second chance in this, because you will not raise it twice. I know, said Damaris. Have you a child of 2 in mind? Said Mr. Woolcott, in the voice of a man who already knows the answer and is hoping to be wrong. She had. His name was John Combe, and he was 1 year and 11 months old. His father had been a withy cutter in the bottom below Barrowcombe, and had been killed by a falling elm in the March of 1808, 7 months before the boy was born, and his mother, Sarah Combe, had taken a fever in the April of that same year, 1810, and had died in 3 days at the age of 26, and the boy had gone on the parish, and the overseers of Barrowcombe had boarded him out with Widow Dyke at 9 pence a week, which was what Barrowcombe paid for a child, and which was neither generous nor cruel, but simply the rate. He was small. His chest had whistled since the first winter. There were 2 of the vestry who had said out loud, in the way people did then, without meaning anything unkind by it, that the 9 pence would not be wanted long. Damaris knew him because Widow Dyke came up to Barrowcombe 2 days a week, and had brought him with her since April, in a basket at first and then walking, and he sat on the linhay step in the sun with a wooden spoon while the women worked, and Damaris had watched him for 5 months. She had watched him for 5 months entirely deliberately, and she was never in her life able to make that sound like anything but what it was. She had watched him drink his milk. She had watched him get over a cough in June in 4 days that would have kept another child in bed a fortnight. She had put her hand flat on his back one morning while he breathed, and had counted, and had gone on counting for 4 days running, and written the counts in the back of the cheese book, because she had no other way of judging a chest, and she was not going to judge it by how sorry she felt. She told Mr. Woolcott all of that in about 6 sentences, standing up in a flat voice, and then she said, "He is the youngest sound life in this parish, and he has nobody. There is no father to come to me in 9 years and say the farm is his. There is no family to fall out with any other family. There is nobody in the world it can do any harm to, and if he lives, he will have a place to live in for the whole of his life, which he has not got at present." Mr. Woolcott sat for a long time. "You understand," he said at last, "that you are putting your father's house, and your sister, and yourself, and every one of those £246 upon the breath of a parish child of 2 years old with a bad chest." "I am putting it on the longest life in the parish," said Damaris. "Sir Hugh's own grandson is 9, and if I could have named him I would." Mr. Woolcott laughed out loud at that, which surprised them both, and then he got up and went to the door and told his clerk to draw the memorandum, and to send down to the vicarage for Mr. Loveridge, and to tell Sir Hugh that he was wanted with his seal in an hour, and that he would explain it all afterwards, and that it was quite regular, and to say nothing to anybody in the servants' hall about the amount. "There is one more thing," said Damaris when he came back. "Will you put in it that he is a child of this parish and the son of Sarah Combe, widow, deceased? By name?" "Why?" said Mr. Woolcott. "Because in 50 years," said Damaris, "somebody is going to have to prove which John Combe, and there are 3 of that name in Bridgewater alone. Put in the parish and the mother and his age. And ask Mr. Loveridge to bring the register with him, and to read the baptism out before he witnesses, so that he can swear afterwards that he compared them." Mr. Woolcott said afterwards that he had known 1 attorney in Taunton and 2 in Exeter who would not have thought of that in 1810, and that he had gone out into the passage and stood there for a minute with his hand on the wall. It was done at 4 in the afternoon in the estate office at Rodon, with the window open and the smell of cut grass coming in. Sir Hugh Marchant came down in his riding coat, with his seal ring on, and his spectacles pushed up, 82 years old, and straight as a gatepost. And he read the memorandum through twice, and asked 2 questions. The first was whether the fine had been paid in full, and Mr. Woolcott said it had, in his presence, that morning, and showed him the bag. The second he asked of Damaris directly, looking at her over the top of the paper. "Whose money is this, young woman?" "Mine," said Damaris. Sir Hugh looked at Mr. Woolcott, who said, in the voice of a man who has decided to spend some credit, "Every penny of it earned by her since the February of 1808, Sir Hugh. And I have watched her do it. And I have not helped her by so much as a shilling. And I should be obliged if you would ask me no more about it in her hearing." Sir Hugh Marchant put the paper down and looked at Damaris Escott for the space of about 5 seconds, and then he said, "Then it is the best bought life in this county." And he took the pen and signed his name, and the H went shaky as it always did now, and Mr. Woolcott dropped the wax, and Sir Hugh set the ring into it, and it was witnessed by Ambrose Woolcott, steward, and by Thomas Loveridge, clerk, vicar of the parish, who had ridden up with the parish register in a saddle-bag, and had read out the baptism of John, son of Sarah Combe, widow, born the 11th day of October 1808, before he put his name to anything, exactly as he had been asked to do. The stamp was impressed on the 14th by the distributor at Taunton, and cost £1.15 out of the £6 Mr. Woolcott had allowed for. And that was the whole of it. It took 11 minutes, and there were 4 people in the room, and one of them was under 19 years of age, and had walked 9 miles that morning with the price of it in a butter basket. She went home on the carrier's cart, because Mr. Woolcott made her, and paid the carrier 4pence, and got in at 9 at night, and told Grace, and Grace cried, and Damaris did not. She went to the vestry the following week, and asked the overseers to let her have the boy boarded at Barrowcombe at the parish rate, and the overseers, who had a hard year and were glad of it, agreed at once, and she took him up the lane on a Tuesday in October, walking, holding his hand, with Widow Dyke carrying his other things in a bundle, which came to a shirt, a frock, a pair of shoes too big for him, and a wooden spoon. She drew the 9pence a week for 11 weeks, and then in the January she went back to the vestry and asked them to strike him off the book. And they asked her why, and she said she would rather keep him herself. And they wrote in the overseer's book, John Combe, taken off the parish by Damaris Escott of Barrowcombe at her own charge, and that entry is there still, and it was read out in a public room 11 years afterwards to considerable effect. She never adopted him, because there was no such thing to be done in England then. She never called herself his mother, and never let anybody else call her so, and he called her Miss Damaris from the first week to the last. What she did was feed him, and keep him dry, and keep him warm, and get the doctor from Bishop's Lydeard 4 times in 3 winters at 7, and 6pence a visit which she could very ill afford, and teach him his letters at 4, and his figures at 5. And by the time he was 7, he could do a column of pounds, shillings, and pence in his head, faster than the clerk at the cheese factors, which was the one thing about him that made her laugh out loud. Grace Escott died on the 10th of March, 1811, of a decline at 23, in the room over the kitchen where her mother had died. It was 5 months and 26 days after the memorandum was sealed. There is no way to write that sentence so that it does not sound like a story arranged for effect, and it is not. It is what happened. And Mr. Loveridge entered the burial on the 12th, and Damaris Escott stood in the churchyard for the 3rd time in 7 years. And when they came back to the house, she went and stood on a chair and took down the tin box and looked at the memorandum and put it back, and then she went out and did the milking, because there were 18 cows, and the boy was 2. If she had gone to Rawdon in the September of 1811 instead of the September of 1810, there would have been nothing to add a life to. The paper must be mended while it is whole. Mr. Woolcott had told her that in a little room with a map on the wall when she was 15 years old, and he had said it once, and she had heard it. Her father lived 4 years more. He died on the last day of July, 1815, in the porch, in the sun, with the boy of 6 sitting on the step beside him, and he was buried on the 2nd of August, and Mr. Loveridge entered him as Nathaniel Escott, the elder yeoman, which was the entry that Mr. Ozias Kite read 6 years afterwards and got wrong. And after that there were 10 quiet years, which is what all this was for, and which nobody ever tells you about, because there is nothing in them to tell. She held Barrow Combe. She paid £1 6 shillings and 8 pence and 2 capons every Lady Day, and walked the 9 miles down and back. She put the west end of the thatch right in 1813, and the whole of it in 1819. She grubbed out 11 dead trees in the orchard and planted 34, of which 29 took. And it was said in that parish for 2 generations afterwards that Escott's Kingston Blacks made the best cider between the Quantocks and the Blackdowns, and that the reason was that a woman had planted them at 24, knowing perfectly well she would be 70 before they came into their strength. She kept the teasel ground and cut it herself in the good years. She bought back a mare in 1800, and 17 out of the same blood as the colt she had sold, because she had never got over that and never pretended she had. She did not marry, and there were 3 offers, and she refused all 3, and to the 3rd of them, which was a good one, from a widower at Hulse, with 100 acres of his own. She said the only true thing she ever said on the subject to anybody, which was that she would not put a farm that stood on a child's life into the hands of a man who might one day be sorry he had taken it on. She was 24. She said afterwards that she had thought at the time that she was being sensible, and had found out at 30 that she had been afraid, and that there was no great difference between the two in a woman of that age, and no use pretending there was. The boy grew. He did not get big, but he got tough, and the whistle in his chest came only in a wet February. And Dr. Bennett, who saw him at 9, said the thing that Damaris kept in her head for years afterwards, that a chest of that kind either kills a child by 5 or turns into nothing much at all by 15. And that she had been very lucky, and she said, "No, sir, I have been very careful." And Dr. Bennett, who was a decent man, said, "Yes, you have." Sir Hugh Marchant died in the spring of 1819 at 91. Ambrose Woolcott, who had been steward 31 years, and had by then been carried to the audit in a chair for 2 years running, died in the January of 1820, 5 weeks after his master, and left his books in the estate office because they were not his to leave anywhere else. Mr. Julian Marchant, who was 60 and had a house in Bath and no interest whatever in Somerset, sold the entire Rodon estate, 11 farms and the mansion and the moor, to Mr. Zachary Truscott of Bristol in the July of 1820, and the muniments went with it in 5 chests, and Mr. Ozias Kite came down in the August to make it pay. And so the whole of it turned, in the end, upon the fact that a man who was very good at his work opened the ledger that was on the desk in front of him, and did not open the 5 chests that had been carried past his door in a cart. Now the thing that Mr. Ozias Kite never afterwards forgave himself for was not the sentence he said to the room. It was that he turned the ledger round. He had done it for effect, so that the 61 men on the benches could see the page and understand that he was reading and not inventing, and he had held it down with his flat hand and left it there, facing the room for the better part of 4 minutes while he talked. And a woman was standing at the trestle 2 feet away, with nothing whatever to do, and she had learned to read a clerk's hand at 12 years old off a parchment in a linhay, and she read that page upside down the whole time he was speaking, which is a thing you can do quite easily, with a fair engrossing hand, and a wide margin, and she read the marginal note. It was in old ink, in a hand she knew better than her own father's, because she had had letters and receipts in it for 12 years. It said, Vide Lease BK, Foe, 111. She had written that on the back of her receipt underneath the 3 names, and she had folded the receipt and carried it 9 miles home, and she had not mentioned it to Mr. Sully on the Saturday until he had finished telling her everything he intended to do, at which point she took it out and put it on his desk, and Mr. Sully read it and used a word he afterwards apologized for. That single line altered the whole shape of the business, because it meant 3 things at once. It meant there was a lease book. It meant the entry for Barrowcombe stood at folio 111 of it. And it meant that the estate's own current ledger, the one Mr. Kite had been reading from and thumping and quoting to a room full of farmers, carried on its face a direction to go and look somewhere else. And that Mr. Kite had not gone and looked. The correspondence took from April to July, and there is a great deal of it, and almost all of it is dull, which is how these things are actually won. Mr. Sully wrote to Messrs. Crocombe and Son of Small Street, Bristol, who had conducted the purchase for Mr. Truscott, requiring an inspection of folio 111 of the Rowdon lease book. Messrs. Crocombe replied in 11 days that they held documents for a client and could not produce them to a stranger. Mr. Sully wrote again, citing Miss Escott's interest as a person claiming under the very title in question. Messrs. Crocombe replied in 9 days that they had taken their client's instructions and their client had referred them to his agent. Mr. Kite wrote to Mr. Sully that he had reviewed the position and saw no reason to alter it, and that the estate's records were the estate's affair, and that if Miss Escott believed she had a lease, she was at liberty to defend an ejectment, which would come on at the assizes in the spring, at a cost to her of not less than £150, and that he mentioned the sum only from motives of humanity. Mr. Sully brought that letter up to Barrowcombe himself in a gig, which for a man with 2 gouty feet was the equivalent of a pilgrimage, and he put it on the kitchen table and said, "He is going to grind you. He can spend Mr. Truscott's money, and you must spend your own, and he knows it, and there is nothing improper in it, and it is what I should do in his place. Now have you £150? I have £31 and the crop, said Damaris. Then we do not go to law, said Mr. Sully. We go over his head. She wrote the letter herself at that kitchen table on the 3rd of June, 1821, and Mr. Sully corrected 2 words in it, and afterwards said he wished he had left them alone. It was addressed to Mr. Zachary Truscott at his counting house in Bristol, and it did not complain of Mr. Kite, and it did not mention the sentence he had said in front of 61 men, and it did not ask for pity or for time or for a favor of any kind. It was 1 page. It said that she held a lease of Barrow Combe Farm for 3 lives granted by Sir Hugh Marchant in 1796, that a 4th life had been added by memorandum on the 12th of September 1800, and 10 upon payment of a fine of £240, which she had paid, that the life so added was John Combe of Barrow Combe, born the 11th of October 1808, who was living and in good health, and was at that moment in the yard outside the window, that his agent had informed 61 of Mr. Truscott's tenants that no such lease existed, and that the entry would be found at folio 111 of Mr. Truscott's own lease book, which was in the 4th of the 5 chests then lying in Messrs. Crocom's strong room in Small Street. She enclosed a copy of the memorandum, a copy of the receipt, and a copy of the vestry minute of Easter Monday, signed by 31 men. And she finished by saying that she did not ask him to take her word for any of it, and that she would be content if he would direct his own attorneys to open his own book. Mr. Zachary Truscott was 51 and had begun as a clerk, and had bought the Rodon estate for £29,000, because land was what a Bristol man bought when he wished to be taken seriously, and he had never seen it and did not intend to, and he was not a kind man and was not an unkind one. He read the letter on the 6th of June. He is said to have read it twice. What he did was neither generous nor personal. He wrote 4 lines to Crocombe directing them to open the 4th chest and report, because a man who has paid £29,000 for a property wishes to know what he has bought, and does not wish to hear about it first from a judge. Crocombe's clerk opened the 4th chest on the 11th of June, and found the Rodon lease book, quarto, bound in vellum, 340 leaves, in the hand of Ambrose Woolcott from 1801 onward, and at folio 111, under the heading Barrow Combe Farm, in the parish of Barrow Combe, the entry of the lease of 1796 with the 3 lives, and beneath it, in the same hand, dated the 12th of September 1810, a life added, viz. John Combe of this parish, infant son of Sarah Combe, widow decked, aged 1 year and 11 months. Fine £240 paid in full by Damaris Escott. Memorandum endorsed on both parts, and stamped, wit, by me and by the vicar. Note, the money is her own. A.W. Note, the money is her own. Ambrose Woolcott had been dead 1.5 years, and he had written that in his own book 11 years before anybody needed it, because he was a steward of the old kind, and a steward of the old kind writes down what he knows. Damaris Escott paid 13 shillings and 4pence to Messrs. Crocombe and Son for an office copy of folio 111, examined and signed by their clerk, and she paid it in silver at the counter in Small Street on the 29th of June, 1821, having gone up on the Bristol coach from Taunton on the Thursday, at a cost of 9 shillings inside and 4 and 6 on the roof, and she went on the roof, in a thunderstorm. Both ways. The 13 and 4pence was butter money. She noted it in the book, as she had noted the teasels and the geese 11 years before, in the same square hand, in the same 3 columns. Mr. Kite received his copy of the folio on the 4th of July, and he did not give way, and this is the part of the story that people always get wrong when they tell it in the Dean, because they like him to crumple, and he did not crumple for another 3 months. What he did was reply at length in a letter of 5 pages that Mr. Sully described as the best written wrong thing he had ever read in his life. He said that a steward's private book was not evidence of a sealed instrument. He said that the memorandum was in a hand, not the hand of the lease. He said that the estate's rent ledger, which was the working record of the property, had carried the holding for 6 years as a tenancy at will, and that 6 years of a man's own entries could not be swept away by one line of another man's. He said that he did not for a moment impute fraud to Miss Escott, and then he spent a page and a half describing the circumstances in which an elderly steward in failing health might be induced to sign a memorandum, which is a way of imputing fraud while writing that you do not. And then, at the end, he made the mistake that finished him. And he made it out of pride and not out of malice. He said that since the question touched the customs and the tenantry of the manor, and since it had first been raised at a public audit, it should be settled in public, and that he would bring the whole matter before the court baron of the manor of Rodon, to be held at the Marchant Arms in Barrowcombe on Tuesday the 9th of October, before the homage, and that he would there produce the estate's books, and that he invited Miss Escott to produce whatever she might have. Mr. Sully read that paragraph 3 times, and then put the letter down and said, "To nobody at all he has chosen the room." She had told John Combe the truth on the 9th of May, in the orchard, while they were propping a tom-putt that had split in the wind, and she had chosen the orchard because it was a job with something to do in it, and because she did not want him looking at her face. She told it in order, and she did not soften it. The lease. The 3 lives. Her mother, her brother, her sister. The £246 and where every pound of it came from, including the colt. The tables in Dr. Price's book, the reason a child of 2 was worth more than a woman of 18. And then the sentence she had been turning over since April, which came out worse than she had meant it to because there is no good way to say it, that the farm was held for the term of his natural life, and that when he died, whenever that might be, Barrowcombe went back to the owner of the soil, and that this had been true since he was not yet 2 years old, and would be true until he was an old man. John Combe held the prop and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Then I am the farm." "No," said Damaris. "You are a boy and the farm is a farm. The paper is the farm. You are only the reason the paper is still good. If I die, you go," he said. "Yes," said Damaris. He was quiet the rest of that afternoon, and at supper, and the next day, and for about 9 days after that, and what he did in those 9 days frightened her more than anything Mr. Kite had ever said to her. He would not go up the ladder to the loft. He would not lead the young horse. He came in out of the rain like an old woman, and sat by the fire when he ought to have been at the withies, And on the 9th day she came round the corner of the linhay, and found him standing quite still in the middle of the yard, doing nothing at all, and she understood that he had been standing there some time, because he could not think of a thing that was safe to do. She took him into the kitchen and sat him down, and said the thing that people in that parish still quoted at each other 50 years afterwards, without knowing where it came from. "John Combe," she said, "you are not a candle. You are a boy of 12 with a good chest and a hard head and a great deal of work in front of you. I did not buy your life. Nobody can buy a life. What I bought was 11 minutes of a clerk's time in an estate office, and a piece of red wax, and the right to go on living in this house while you go on living your own, wherever you live it. If you go for a soldier at 18, I shall not stop you, and the lease will go to India with you and come back with you, or not. If you take a farm at Wellington and never come here again from one year's end to the next, the lease stands just the same. It does not want you here. It does not want you careful. It wants you alive, which you are going to be for 60 years, and the way to be alive for 60 years is not to stand in a yard being afraid of a ladder. Now go and get the ladder." He got the ladder. He was up in the loft in 4 minutes, and he stayed up there rather longer than the job wanted, and she let him, and when he came down he ate an enormous supper, and asked her whether the tables in Dr. Price's book had a column for a person who was already 12, and she said they had. And he said, "What does it give me?" And she got out the paper where she had copied the column at Rowdon 11 years before, and showed him, and he read it and said, 45 years and 11 months. And then, after a moment, with the first cheerfulness he had shown in a fortnight, "Then you had a bargain, Mr. Morris." That summer was the hardest working summer of her life, because she had to farm and fight at the same time, and she could afford to let go of neither. The parish carried her a good deal of the way, in the manner of parishes, which is to say silently, and by doing ordinary things slightly differently. Mr. Whitmore, who was still down in Mr. Kite's book to receive Barrow Combe at Lady Day, came up in June and asked whether he might buy her hay standing, and paid £4 over the value, and when she said so, he said he had made a mistake in his sum, and would be obliged if she would not correct it. The Andals took her sheep on the hill again for nothing, as they had in 1806. Widow Dyke, who was now 79, came up 2 days a week as she had for 15 years, and sat and shelled peas and told the boy about his mother, which was a thing nobody else could do. Mr. Loveridge preached, on the 2nd Sunday in July, on the text of the 8th chapter of Deuteronomy, on the setting of landmarks and the memory of the poor, and preached it badly, as he preached everything. And every soul in that church knew what it was about. And Silas Chorley bought her apples. That was all he did, and it is worth setting down exactly, because a great many people in the Dean afterwards said that Chorley had saved Barrow Combe, and he had not, and he was the first to say so, and he said it in the flattest possible way whenever it came up. I bought her fruit. I bought it every year before, and I bought it every year after, and I paid the same price, and if I had paid a farthing over, she would have known it in a minute, and I should not have been let in the yard again. He came up in the middle of September with 2 wagons for the early cider fruit, as he had come up in the middle of September for 11 years, and he stayed 3 days, as he always did, and he mended the second bearing on the press, because it wanted mending and he had the tools with him, and he ate his dinner in the kitchen with Damaris and the boy, and he did not once mention Mr. Kite, or the audit, or the court that was coming in 3 weeks. And this was not stupidity, and it was not shyness. It was the only kindness in the whole of that year that did not require her to be grateful for it. On the last evening he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at the sky and said that they would want another hand at the court to carry the books if she had nobody, and that he could send his man. And Damaris said that Mr. Sully had a clerk, and Silas Chorley said, "Very good," and got up on the wagon and went to Taunton, and did not ask again, and turned up on the 9th of October anyway, and stood at the back of the room. The night before the court she went through the tin box on the kitchen table one last time, with the boy sitting opposite, doing sums on the slate. The lease. The memorandum, the receipt of the 12th of September 1810. The office copy of folio 111, examined and signed. Mr. Loveridge's certified extracts of 5 entries out of the register. A copy of the overseer's minute of January 1811, John Combe, taken off the parish by Damaris Escott at her own charge. The vestry minute of Easter Monday, the stitched paper book of 40, leaves with what is wanted £246 across the first page, and every shilling of it entered underneath in 3 columns with the dates. She put them in order and tied them with the tape she had bought in Taunton 11 years before, on the day she sold the colt, because she had bought a quire of paper and a pennyworth of tape, and had used the paper for the book, and had never had a use for the tape until that night. Then she went to bed and slept, which she said afterwards nobody ever believed, and it was true. And it was the plain result of having done a thing thoroughly. The court baron of the manor of Rodon was held in the long room of the Marchant Arms at Barrow Combe on Tuesday the 9th of October, 1821, and it began at 11 in the morning, and there were more people in that room than had ever been in it before or since, including the night of the peace. It was a whitewashed room over the stable yard, with 2 windows facing southeast, and a fire laid at the end, and the October sun came in low and hard, and lay in 2 long slabs across the boards, and the tops of the benches, and the whole room was as bright as a dairy. Forms had been carried up from the tap. There were 91 men in it, and, standing at the back along the wall, where nobody could afterwards say they had been sitting in a court, 11 women. Damaris Escott sat at the front on the left, with Mr. Sully beside her, and a japanned tin box on the bench between them and the boy on her other side. At the trestle at the top sat Mr. Ozias Kite in the same snuff-brown coat as steward of the manor, with the estate's books, and Mr. Pring, and at the side of the room, in a chair that had been carried up at 9 that morning by a potboy who had no idea who he was fetching it for, sat a square, grey, plainly dressed man of 51, with a Bristol accent and a bad wig, who had come down the day before in a post-chaise unannounced, and had slept at the Marchant Arms under his own name, which nobody in the house had recognized. It was Mr. Zachary Truscott, who had never in his life seen the land he owned. He had walked round Barrow Combe Farm at 7 o'clock that morning, by himself in the wet, and had counted the trees in the orchard, and had put his hand on the thatch of the linhay, and had said nothing to anybody, and had gone back and had his breakfast. The homage was sworn first, as it always is, 17 tenants of the manor, called by name, sworn on the book to present the truth of what they knew. their foreman, was Mr. Whitmore, who was the man down in the ledger to receive Barrowcombe Farm at Lady Day, and who had not slept well since March, and who took the oath in a voice that could be heard in the stable yard. Mr. Kite opened for the estate, and he did it well. He was on his own ground, and he had prepared, and he spoke for 40 minutes without a note, and without once raising his voice. And any stranger coming in at the door would have said the woman on the front bench was finished. He put in the rent ledger of 1819 and read the entries for 6 years. He put in the extracts from the register. He said, and it was true, that no fine of £240 appeared in any account of the estate that he had ever seen. He said, and it was true, that the memorandum relied upon was written in a hand not the hand of the lease. He said that Mr. Woolcott was dead and could not be asked. And he said, in his dry, carrying, reasonable voice, that he had no personal feeling in the matter whatever, and that his duty was to the property. Then Mr. Aaron Sully got up, which took him some time on account of his feet, and said that he would trouble the homage with 5 things, and would be as quick as his gout allowed, and that he would begin by asking every gentleman present to handle a piece of parchment. He untied the tape, and took out the lease and read the parcels aloud, every field on the farm by name, Long Ridding and Priest's Close, and 100, and the 19 acres, and Cuckoo Hill, and the Sheep Slate, and Well Furlong, and the bottom, and the withy bed thereato belonging, and the room listened to that the way a congregation listens to a psalm it knows. Because there were men on those benches whose fathers had ploughed Well Furlong. Then he read the habendum and the 3 lives. Then he turned the skin over, and read the memorandum of the 12th of September 1810 aloud, slowly, twice, all of it, down to the last line, in the same manner and to all intents, as if the said John Combe had been named a life in the said lease at the making thereof. Then he said, Now, gentlemen, look at the corner of it. That mark impressed in the skin is the stamp of the Stamp Office, and it carries its own date, and it cannot be got afterwards without a penalty and a certificate, and it is not the writing of any man in this room. Let it go along the front bench, and let every one of the homage put his thumb on it. The parchment went along 17 pairs of hands, and it took 4 minutes, and nobody said a word while it went, and that was the moment, though nobody knew it yet. Second, he called the Reverend Thomas Loveridge, who was sworn, and who said that he had ridden to Rowdon on the 12th of September 1810 at Mr. Woolcott's asking, carrying the parish register in a saddlebag, that he had read out the baptism of John's son of Sarah Combe, widow, before he put his name to anything, that he had seen Sir Hugh Marchant sign with his own hand and set his own ring in the wax, and that he had compared the child in the memorandum with the child in the register at the time, on purpose, at Miss Escott's own request, because she had said that in 50 years somebody would have to prove which John Combe. Third, he put in the office copy of folio 111 of the Rowdon lease book, examined and signed by Messrs. Crocombe's clerk, and he read that aloud too. And when he came to the last line of it, he read it twice, note, The money is her own. A. W. Fourth, he said, upon the question of identity, which is the only question in this room that is worth 2 straws. And he put in the certified extract of the baptism, and the overseer's book of the parish of Barrowcombe, which the churchwardens had brought up in a sack, open at the minute of January 1811, John Combe, taken off the parish by Damaris Escott of Barrowcombe at her own charge, and he called Widow Dyke, who was 79, and had to be helped up onto a chair to be seen, and who was sworn, and who said in a perfectly clear voice that she had nursed Sarah Combe in her fever, and had carried the child to the font herself, and had boarded him at 9d. a week for 2 years, and had carried his bundle up the lane to Barrowcombe on a Tuesday in October 1810, and that the bundle had a shirt and a frock and a pair of shoes too big for him, and a wooden spoon in it, and that she had known him every day of his life since, and that he was sitting on the second form from the front with his boots polished. And fifth, said Mr. Sully, I ask the homage to observe that the estate's own ledger, the book that has been quoted to this parish twice, carries in its margin, against Barrowcombe, in the steward's hand, the words vidded Lease Book Folio 111. It is on the page that was turned round to face the room at the audit on Lady Day. Every man who was in that room could have read it. One woman did. Then he stopped, and there was a silence of the kind that has weight in it, and Mr. Sully said, without any flourish at all, in the voice of a man asking whether the post had come, Is John Combe in this room? And a boy of 12 years and 11 months stood up off the second form. He stood up straight with his hands at his sides and his chin up, the way she had told him at 6 o'clock that morning in the kitchen. And he was small for his age, and his hair would not lie down at the crown, and his boots were polished, and 91 men and 11 women turned round and looked at him, and he looked back at them and did not shift his feet. Mr. Sully said, What is your name? John Combe, sir. Where were you born? In this parish, sir. What was your mother's name? Sarah Combe, sir. She was a widow. She died when I was not 2. How old are you? 12, sir. 13 on Thursday. I was born the 11th of October, 1808. Thank you, said Mr. Sully. Sit down. The boy sat down. And what happened then in that long room was not a cheer, because they were Somerset men, and it was a court, and it was not laughter either. It was a sound that men who were there described for the rest of their lives as the whole room letting out its breath at once, and it went on for perhaps 3 seconds, and old Mr. Yondell said, in the carrying voice of the deaf, God bless the boy, and somebody at the back said Amen. And Mr. Whitmore, foreman of the homage, put his hand over his eyes. Mr. Ozias Kite took off his spectacles. He took out a handkerchief and polished them, both glasses, unhurriedly, and put them back on, and looked down at the green ledger in front of him, for what the room afterwards agreed was the better part of a minute. Then he said, in the same dry voice he had used on Lady Day, with no more colour in it than a man reading a weather glass, then the entry in this ledger is wrong. Then mend it, said Mr. Sully. The homage went out into the tap room for 11 minutes, and came back, and Mr. Whitmore read the presentment, which had been written on a half-sheet by the youngest of them, because he had the best hand. We the homage of this manor, being sworn, present that the messuage and lands called Barrowcombe Farm are held under a lease of the 10th of April 1796 for the life of John Combe of this parish, an infant added by memorandum of the 12th of September 1810, and that the said John Combe is living and is in this room. 17 names under it, and Mr. Pring copied the whole of it onto the court roll that afternoon in the same room, and it is on the roll, and the roll is in the county record office, and anybody may go and read it." Then Mr. Zachary Truscott got up out of his chair at the side, and every head in the room turned, and half of them had no idea who he was. He said 4 things, and sat down. He said that he was the owner of the soil, and had come to hear it for himself. He said that the notice to quit served upon Miss Escott on the 4th of April was withdrawn, and would be endorsed withdrawn in his own hand before he left the room. He said that the sums taken from her for use and occupation since Lady Day would be repaid to her with the rent receipts corrected, and that the reserved rent of £1 6 and 8 and 2 capons would be received at Rodan on the 25th of March, as it had been received since 1796, and would be received so for as long as the lease ran. And then he said, without looking at anybody in particular, "Miss Kite, you will amend the ledger this afternoon in the presence of the homage, and when you have amended it, you will read the amendment aloud in this room." He did it at 4 o'clock. He ruled 2 neat lines through 6 years of his own entries, and wrote in the margin, in a hand that did not shake at all, struck out, "This holding is held by lease for the life of John Combe of this parish, added by memorandum 12th September 1810, fine £240, paid by Damaris Escott. See Lease Book Folio 111. Amended by me, O. Kite, 9th October 1821. And then he stood up in front of 17 sworn men and 90 others and read it out from the first word to the last. And his voice did not alter, and when he had finished he closed the book. He came to her at the foot of the stairs afterwards, while the room was emptying, with his green umbrella under his arm. He did not apologize, then or ever, and Damaris said afterwards that she had not wanted him to, because an apology would have obliged her to say something gracious, and she had nothing gracious in her. What he said was, "You read that ledger upside down at the audit." "I did," said Damaris. "Mr." Kite nodded once, as a man does when a sum comes out. "I turned it round myself," he said, and went down the stairs and out into the yard, and stayed on at Rodan 11 months more, and did his work, and was moved by Mr. Truscott in the September following to an estate in Monmouthshire, where he did very well, and where he is said to have kept, all his life, the habit of never turning a book to face a room. She was repaid £9 4s. She was owed it, and it was not a fortune, and she put it into the thatch. Silas Chorley came up for the late fruit on the 22nd of October with 2 wagons, as he had come for 12 years, and they loaded the Kingston blacks. And on the second evening, he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and said that he had had it in his mind for about 9 years to ask her something, and had never once thought the time was right, and that he did not think the time was right now either, but that he was 34, and she was 29, and he had decided that there was no such thing as the right time, and there was only asking or not asking. And Damaris Escott, who had refused 3 men and had given a good reason every time, stood in her own yard with her hands cracked from the dairy, and could not think of a single one. The banns were called in the parish church of Barrowcombe on the 3 Sundays before Christmas, and they were married on the 2nd of January, 1822, by the Reverend Thomas Loveridge, who had taught her Latin for 4 years for nothing, and had witnessed the best morning's work of her life in an estate office 11 years before. Mr. Aaron Sully gave her away, on 2 gouty feet, and complained about it, and would not sit down afterwards, and charged her nothing. John Combe, 13, walked in front of her from the porch, with nothing in his hands at all, and did not know what to do with them, and at the church door afterwards he took her basket off her arm, without being asked, which was the only sentence either of them ever spoke on the subject. They had 2 daughters and a son. Silas Chorley moved his cooperage out from Taunton to the yard at Barrowcombe in 1824, and the pressing was done at home after that, and her husband never in his life owned a rod of the land he worked on, and used to say, when strangers asked whose farm it was, that it was his wife's, while John Combe drew breath, and that the arrangement suited him very well, and had been made by a better man of business than he was. John Combe grew 6 feet in the summer of his 18th year, exactly as nobody had expected, and never had another bad winter. He worked at Barrowcombe until he was 26, and then took a farm of his own at Milverton on a lease for 1 life, which was his own, and which he chose himself, and paid the fine for himself, out of his own money, and rode over to Barrowcombe once a month for 40 years. He was married in 1840, and had 9 children, and the eldest of them was a girl called Damaris. In 1834, Mr. Zachary Truscott, who was breaking up the Rodone estate to put the money into railway shares, offered the freehold of Barrowcombe Farm to the tenant in possession for £1,100. And Damaris Chorley bought it, and paid 700 down out of 11 years of cider and teasels, and the rest over 4 years. And the conveyance was drawn by a young man in Mr. Sully's old office in Hammett Street, and is dated the 4th of June, 1834. She read it through twice before she signed it, which took her 20 minutes, and there was 1 word in the parcels she did not care for, and it was altered. She lived to be 82. She died at Barrowcombe on the 9th of March, 1874, in the room over the kitchen where her mother and her sister had died. And John Combe was in the house, and he was 65, and he outlived her by 14 years. And the whole of that time the lease that had been mended in an estate office in 1810 was still, on paper, perfectly good, though it had long since ceased to matter. And that was the point of the exercise. The japanned tin box went to her eldest daughter, and then to her granddaughter, and it is in the family still. It has in it a lease of 1796 with a memorandum on the back, and a red seal and a stamp in the corner, a receipt in the hand of Ambrose Woolcott, steward, dated the 12th of September 1810, an office copy of folio 111, a stitched paper book of 40 leaves, with 3 ruled columns, and what is wanted, £246 written across the first page, a pair of spectacles nobody can wear, and, loose in the bottom corner, 1 sixpence of the reign of King George III, worn quite smooth, which was the change out of 2 capons sold at the top of Taunton Market on the 11th of September, 1810, by a girl of 18 who was 5 shillings short of a farm.